When Java developers first encounter response entities in real-life Spring Boot projects, they often assume it's an advanced feature that is something to learn and use later. On the surface, that is understandable, but lack of response entities creates confusion rather than simplicity. The important thing to realize is that the controllers are not about returning Java objects. They are actually about producing HTTP responses more than anything else, and HTTP responses always have three parts that are a status code, some headers, and a response body. Now, these parts exist even when you don't see them in your Java code. Let's start with the simple endpoint as an example. Even if you have no trace of response entity in this class, Spring will still construct an HTTP response for this endpoint, whether you specify the details or not. And the question is whether this happens implicitly or explicitly. For example, in this case, we are returning a simple user Java object, so Spring decides those HTTP related parts implicitly. But when your method, for example, returns a response entity of a user, then you decide them explicitly and intentionally. So in a nutshell, response entities are not about writing more code or being more sophisticated or advanced. It is about stating intent clearly and precisely, and therefore avoiding potential confusions. So let's start from the initial example. I have a very simple Spring Boot application with a single endpoint in it that you can use to retrieve mock user data. And just to make sure that it works, I'm going to first run this application. And if we see it running, yes, we have the start example application log here. I'm going to jump over to the built-in IntelliJ terminal to send a request to see if that works. I'm going to start out by writing curl, and actually my terminal is kind enough to help me with the rest, which is not ideal if you're a beginner, but feel free to pause and try to understand what's happening here. And when I press enter, yes, this works just fine as expected. We hit the endpoint and we get the JSON back. But let's ask ourselves a more precise question. What HTTP response is this method actually producing? Because right now, we don't see a status code, we don't see headers, we only see a Java object serialized in a JSON format. Yet if I extend the capabilities of this curl request by adding a curl option called verbose mode by saying -v, again, which stands for verbose mode, that makes the terminal print detailed information about the request and the response you might not want to see in normal use cases. And now when I do this, we are certainly seeing some HTTP related parts, and those parts did not appear out of nowhere. Spring actually created them for you. And this is one of the key ideas for this particular video. Every REST controller method or your endpoints or your APIs, they all already create a full HTTP response. And the only difference is that if you are explicit about it or not. Now let's refactor this API beyond the happy path, because the problem, the need for response entities, appears when things stop being normal. So for example, instead of the user with the user ID 1, I will try to fetch the user data for the user with the user ID 15. And as you can see here on our mock user database, there is no one. But nevertheless, when I request the data, the Spring will still build the default response. And in that response, what we see is the 200 status code with no response body, which means that this was successful. Is that, however, what we actually mean to communicate to the client of this application? Do we really think that an empty response and a success code make sense together? And the answer is probably not. So what we could have done here instead is to return a 404 not found, which usually indicates the missing resource. Now let's rewrite the same endpoint using response entities. First, what we are going to have to do is to change the return type of this method, and from now on this is no longer going to be returning a user directly, but instead it is going to be returning a response entity of type user. Right off the bat, what we are going to see is that the compiler is complaining about the fact that we promised the type response entity with the type user, but what we are doing instead is to provide it with a user, so this is not going to compile. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign this to a user variable. And before returning it, I'm going to check if this user is actually null or not. And if this user object is null, which was the case when we called this API with the pet variable 15, we are going to be returning a response entity not found dot build, which is a convenient way to build 404 responses in Spring Boot. But if not, if the user is not null, then we are going to be returning response entity awk, which is again a convenient way to construct 200 responses with Spring Boot. I'm going to put in the user and end this line. So what we have done here is actually quite straightforward. This is not more advanced or sophisticated. It is just more honest and clear. We are now saying exactly what we mean. If the user exists, return success response 200 OK with a response body. And if the user doesn't exist, instead of 200 success, which is not the case, return a 404 not found with no body. And this method is no longer about returning a Java object. It actually has never been. It is about constructing an HTTP response deliberately. So let's actually rerun this application and retry the same scenarios again. And when I rerun this application and go to my terminal, and I'm going to clear this now so that we can have a fresh start. First, I'm going to start with the happy path, where we try to fetch the data of the user with the user ID 1. And as you can see here, the response is still the same. We still have a success response, and we still get the user details of the per user John. But the difference is when I hear, and I'm going to clear this again just to make sure that we are working with a clear workspace. Now, if we rerun the second scenario again, where we requested the user data for the user with the user ID 15, what we are going to realize is that this time around, the application, the API is going to be returning a 404, which is much more honest and intentional because it stands for the resource was not found. And this is the first shift I want you to make. Stop asking what Java object should I return and start asking what kind of an HTTP response should I produce. Now let's look at headers, because this is another place where response entities quietly matter. Imagine we have a user service called, again, user service. And in this user service, we have a create method where we return a user object that is created, that has been created. I will call this create user. You can also call this create user. And normally you would have some sort of object here that you would take in as a request body in your post mapping. But for the demonstration purposes, I will just assume that we are going to be creating a user by constructing the user entity and connecting to a database. What I'm going to do is I'm basically going to return a new user. And the compiler is already complaining about the fact that there is no arguments constructor for this class. So I'm going to make up another user that is going to be newly created, as we will call it. And inside the user controller, I'm going to inject this user service, and then we are going to create the constructor. And the first warning we are going to get is that the class user service is exposed outside this defined visibility scope. And I assume that's because I forgot the annotation at service. You can also call this a component. This is a meta annotation. This is for convenience and maybe self-documenting code, if that makes sense. And now I'm going to create a new API. I'm going to annotate this new Java method with post mapping users, and this method is also going to be returning a response entity of a user. I'm going to call this method create user. Again, ideally you would have some sort of request body and maybe some other stuff that you use to create and construct your user entity before saving it. But in this case, we are just going to assume that this API does not take any sort of input. But what this is going to do is that it is going to create a user, a mock user, using this service method that we just created. And I will have to return this. And this is already wrong because I'm returning a user here, but I'm supposed to be returning a response entity of a user. So what I'm going to say is response entity.awk, and I will give the user object as a parameter. Now, if I run this, as you might expect, now that we have again used the keyword OK, and more specifically the OK method of this response entity builder, when I come back to my terminal and change the HTTP verb to post, because if you remember, if we come back to the user controller here, we have used the post mapping annotation. What I'm going to write is post, and we are still going to use the verbose mode. And practically speaking, this worked just fine. We still get a success response, and we get the newly created user entity in a JSON format. But the thing is, it is actually slightly incorrect, slightly inaccurate from an HTTP perspective, because when you create a resource, the conventional status code is 200O, which stands for created. And ideally, in addition to that status code change, you also send the location header pointing to the newly created resource. And with response entities, this is actually quite trivial. What we can do is that instead of using the awk method, and I'm going to cut this out so that I can reuse it, instead of the awk method, I'm going to use the created method of the body builder, which is the builder class for the response entity. And as you can see here, this is going to require us to provide a URI object. But before that, I'm going to say created, and then I will give the body. And in order to be able to create that location, I will say URI, let's say location equals URI.create. And given that our path for fetching specific users is this one, I'm going to type in /users/ the ID of the saved entity, which is going to be returned by the repository, JPA or CRUD repository we are going to be using in Spring Boot. But now that we don't do that, I'm going to just type 3, or I can actually make it like this. And finally, I'm going to use this location, again, which is the expected parameter for this created method. I'm going to use this location object as a parameter to this method. And now what happens is that if I rerun the application and go back to my terminal again, and I'm going to clear all of this to be actually, I'm going to keep it so that we can compare and contrast. I'm going to make the same post request again. And now if I make this terminal slightly bigger, what we are hopefully going to see is that if I manage to do this, in the first example, we received a response with the success code, which is again 200, and we had no headers other than content type transfer encoding and date. But in this case, we have the status code 201, which indicates created. And not only that, but also it says that there is a location that you can access this newly created resource. Now, if we come back to the code again, if I manage to close this down, what I want you to realize is that, notice that nothing here is actually framework specific apart from the syntax. This is actually just core HTTP expressed clearly in Java. And if you return a plain object, such as a user, instead of a response entity of a user, you cannot reliably and plausibly express this cleanly. But with response entity, it is the natural shape of the code. Now, if we ask if we should use response entity everywhere, the answer is a simple no. And this is an important one, because if you have a simple internal API, let's say you have no error cases, no meaningful headers that you would like to communicate to the client of your Spring Boot application, and you are perfectly fine with a success response for basically everything, returning plain Java objects is perfectly acceptable. But the moment you start to care about correct status codes, or need to signal absence or validation errors or conflicts in your resources, or let's say you want to add or control certain headers, response entity actually stops being optional and starts being the right abstraction or design tool, if that makes more sense. And if you are going to remember only one key takeaway from this video, I absolutely want you to remember this one. Controllers are not about returning Java objects, they're about constructing proper HTTP responses. And response entity just makes that process explicit and intentional. I thank you for your time and following along carefully so far, and I hope to see you in the next one.